June 1914. A special train carried Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne, to Sarajevo, capital of a troubled frontier province. With his wife Sophie by his side, the trip would be as much pleasure as business. But what happened there set off a chain reaction disaster, as a web of diplomatic alliances dragged first Europe and then the entire world into war. A war which swept the royal families from power and permanently changed the face of Europe. Franz Ferdinand would know none of this, because his assassination by terrorists on the streets of Sarajevo was the trigger that started it all. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was 51 years old that summer. He belonged to the oldest and most prestigious royal dynasty in Europe, the Habsburgs, whose unbroken reign over Austria stretched back 900 years. He moved in a world of royal courts, aristocracy, pomp, and privilege. At the time, kings and queens still ruled over almost all of Europe. The Archduke was eager to begin ruling too, despite a rocky path to his current position as heir to the throne.
The Archduke Franz Ferdinand was born at a time when he was not expected to inherit the throne of Austria. He was a very sickly child, suffered from tuberculosis, and nobody in Austria expected much of him. So he had a chip on his shoulder, one can say, and he felt he had to prove himself.
Above all, he had to prove himself to his 84-year-old uncle, Emperor Franz Joseph.
Franz Joseph became the Emperor of Austria at the age of 18 in December 1848. Thus, his entire adult life was spent being king. He was not a warm, cuddly figure. He got up at 4 o'clock in the morning, had a sponge bath, had a cup of coffee and some Viennese rolls, and proceeded to work. He was determined to preserve the power of the monarchy and of the dynasty, and worked zealously to that end.
Franz Joseph had dedicated himself to holding his empire together, but his family was crumbling around him. His brother Maximilian was executed in Mexico. His wife, Empress Elizabeth, stifled by life at court, left him to wander through Europe and was killed by an anarchist. And his only son and heir, Rudolf, and Rudolf's mistress, committed suicide together. But the emperor's nephew and new heir, Franz Ferdinand, had done something truly scandalous. He fell in love and married a woman who was not of royal blood, Sophie Chotek.
Why did he go out on a limb? Does the heart know tradition? I don't think it does. He really deeply loved Sophie. He went against the norm, and it threw everybody in Vienna into a tailspin.
At that time, royal marriages were political arrangements. Kings and queens married their children to the children of other royal families to gain allies or territory. The size of Austro-Hungary was a tribute to generations of shrewd Habsburg marriages. The emperor was furious with Franz Ferdinand's commitment to Sophie and set harsh conditions for the marriage. None of Franz Ferdinand's children, and he would have 3, could inherit the throne. Not only were they cut off from royal privilege, so was Sophie. The Archduke, a loving husband and father, fumed as his wife bore the brunt of the imperial court's anger.
They were brutal. They really, really were. Sophie, although the wife of the heir to the throne, was made to walk at the end of the line, behind the youngest and least important of the people at the Austrian courts.
But Sophie faced such insults only in Vienna. Whenever she and Franz Ferdinand traveled, she literally got the royal treatment. So they traveled as much as possible. One of their favorite destinations was Germany, Austria's neighbor and ally. There, they were honored guests of the emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II.
In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm gave Franz Ferdinand's unequal wife equal footing. And Franz Ferdinand loved that. Franz Ferdinand also felt that with Kaiser Wilhelm, he had a deep friendship.
Franz Ferdinand's royal family was the grandest in Europe, but Kaiser Wilhelm's was the most powerful. His grandmother was Britain's Queen Victoria. She had made sure the royal marriages of her 9 children and 39 grandchildren placed them on thrones throughout Europe, from Sweden to Romania, from Spain to Greece. She called them her royal mob. The incompetence of 2 members of her mob, Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas of Russia, would lead to catastrophe.
It's genetic roulette. Tsar Nicholas was a disastrous ruler. Very nice man. Disastrous ruler. Someone who should not have sat on the throne of Russia. On any throne for that matter. It's completely unprepared. His father felt that Nicholas was just a lost case because he was not very brilliant, not very smart at all. He was kind of like a wet noodle.
His cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm, was smart but overbearing.
The Kaiser, Wilhelm II, was an interesting, strange, contorted individual. He had an ego that was enormous. And in a European era in which other people worked very hard at being the monarch, Kaiser Wilhelm II was lazy. If he spent a couple of hours a day working on royal business, that was a hard day for the Kaiser.
Across the continent, monarchy was facing its greatest challenge yet. People everywhere demanded governments that addressed their needs, not the needs of a privileged few. They wanted protections for workers and a say in how their taxes were spent. They wanted to elect their leaders. Some rulers, like Wilhelm and Nicholas, rigidly resisted change. Others, like Britain's George V, were already constitutional monarchs with only symbolic power. Still others were somewhere in between. In Austria, Franz Ferdinand had reform-minded plans for the future, but could do nothing at present.
He saw his uncle growing older and older and older, and the empire coming to a halt because modernization was not being introduced and political reform was not being introduced. And Franz Ferdinand wanted his own stamp on things. He wanted to change things.
One change he hoped to make was to bring long-ignored ethnic minorities into the government.
He was thinking in some sort of federal principle where everybody had a stake in a multinational government.
Along with internal problems, Austria faced an aggressive southern neighbor, Serbia. A young, ambitious country, Serbia wanted to create a greater Serb kingdom that included any territory where ethnic Serbs lived. Many lived in Austria. But the Serbian government wasn't moving fast enough for a group of fanatics who formed a secret terrorist organization, the Black Hand. Members pledged themselves to the Black Hand Oath to realize the national ideal, the unification of all Serbs. This organization prefers terrorist action to cultural activities.
Nothing was illegitimate, nothing was illegal, nothing was improper in creating that goal.
A hotspot for Black Hand activity was the Austrian province of Bosnia-Herzegovina. It shared a border with Serbia and had a large ethnic Serb population. Bosnia was exactly where Franz Ferdinand was heading in June 1914. His reasons were both personal and political. As future emperor, he wanted to show the Bosnians that he cared. And as a devoted husband, he wanted his wife beside him to celebrate their upcoming wedding anniversary in style.
Because his wife Sophie was treated badly by the Emperor Franz Joseph in Vienna, but would be treated as an equal person in Bosnia, this was a grand trip for both of them to go down to Bosnia, sort of like a vacation.
When word leaked that Franz Ferdinand would be visiting the Bosnian capital, Sarajevo, the Black Hand swung into action. It recruited a group of Bosnian Serb college dropouts and armed them with pistols, bombs, and cyanide capsules to swallow if captured. Rumors and warnings had reached Vienna, but Franz Ferdinand and Sophie refused to change their plans and arrived in Bosnia, undaunted.
They visited the town of Sarajevo on June 27th in the bazaar buying gifts for their children, then went back out and had a dinner the next night before they came in on their fateful ride on June 28th.
The sun shone brightly that morning. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie stepped into the second car of a 6-car motorcade. There were no troops. The Archduke had kept them away as a goodwill gesture. But positioned among the crowd lining the parade route were 7 young terrorists. The first lost his nerve. The second, Nedeljko Kabrinovich, tossed his bomb. It bounced off Franz Ferdinand's car, then exploded in the street and injured several people. Kabrinovich swallowed his cyanide pill and jumped into the nearby river. But the river was almost dry, and the cyanide only made him sick. Police nabbed him within minutes. All the other terrorists froze with fear or ran away, except one. 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip, the ringleader, ducked into a local inn on a corner along the parade route. When the procession reached City Hall, Franz Ferdinand was furious.
Mr. Mayor, one comes here for a visit and is received by bombs. It is outrageous.
He sent his uncle, Franz Joseph, a reassuring telegram about the failed assassination attempt. A newsreel filmed that morning shows the emperor returning to his official duties at the time, greeting school children. He would soon be interrupted again.
Franz Ferdinand and Sophie wanted to go by the hospital to comfort those people who were injured in the morning assassination attempt. So it was decided that the route that his procession would follow was to be changed.
They drove along the river, then came to a crossroads. No one had told the driver about the route change, and he started to turn. An official riding in the car shouted at him to stop. The car stalled, right in front of the corner inn where Princip stood. At that moment, Gavrilo Princip stepped out, only 5 feet from the Archduke. He lifted his pistol, turned his head away, and fired twice. Somehow, his aim was true. Sophie and Franz Ferdinand died in each other's arms. The surrounding crowd beat Princip until the police dragged him away.
It was fate, destiny, call it what you may. But it was just a day fraught with mistakes. It's amazing.
If the driver had been given the correct order to start with, he would have never made the turn, and the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and Sophie would never have been killed.
When the old emperor heard the news, he said, "For me, it is a great worry less." Franz Joseph had never liked his nephew, nor forgiven him for his marriage. An accident of fate had suddenly restored the Habsburg family honor.
As a politician, Franz Joseph probably thought, well, at least we save ourselves the inconvenience, the complication of having the heir married to somebody who is not one of us.
The funeral was small by Habsburg standards. Royal mourners from abroad were discouraged from attending.
It was a sad story that here you have this couple who risked everything to be together, have 3 wonderful children, and in the end, a political assassination takes everything away from them and their kids, who were left alone in a court that didn't like them.
According to tradition, only Franz Ferdinand could be buried in the Habsburg family vault in Vienna. But the Archduke got the last word about his final resting place. He and Sophie were buried side by side, according to his wishes, at their country estate. At first, no one imagined that Franz Ferdinand's murder would become one of the most notorious ever committed.
Assassination of Habsburg officials had taken place not on a routine basis, but not infrequently in the period before 1940. But the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was tremendously different. First of all, he was the heir apparent to the throne of Austria-Hungary. Secondly, he had been a force for peace in the previous tensions between Vienna and Serbia. He did not want a war to break out because he was afraid it might jeopardize his chances for political reform of the monarchy.
Franz Ferdinand had wanted to prevent war. Now his death would lead to one. It was a terrorist group, the Black Hand, that killed the Archduke. But by blaming the Serbian government, not the terrorists, Austrian hardliners saw a chance to take care of troublemaking Serbia once and for all. Things quickly spiraled out of control. Little Serbia had a big friend, Russia, and Austria turned to its ally, Germany. On a continent bound together by military alliances and bristling with armies and weapons, a series of disastrous decisions catapulted Europe's leaders into an enormous conflict none of them expected. And once the war started, it ground on for more than 4 years, killing millions and maiming millions more. It also brought to an end European monarchies' long reign in the halls of power. One by one, Europe's kings and emperors would fall. In Germany, mutinies and revolts shook the government in the war's last months. Kaiser Wilhelm was finally talked into abdicating. He'd spend the rest of his life in exile in the Netherlands. By 1917, Russia had collapsed in civil war and revolution. Pressured from all sides, Tsar Nicholas abdicated his throne. The next year, Nicholas, his wife, their 5 children, 3 servants, and their family doctor were lined up against a storage room wall in Siberia and executed. The fate of their British royal cousins could not have been more different.
England basked in the glory of having won. So the English people were not about to get rid of their king. Their king represented victory. That's why they survived.
As constitutional monarchs, the British royal family left political decisions to elected officials in Parliament and specialized in symbolic gestures, a practice they continue today. In Austria, the elderly Franz Joseph died before the war ended. His successor only ruled for 2 years. By 1919, Austria-Hungary was no more. In its place stood 5 new nations: Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and to the south, the Serb-dominated state of Yugoslavia. The Habsburg dynasty, Europe's oldest and proudest, was only a memory.
The murders at Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, were the most successful terrorist act in history because the conspirators initiated a war which saw their dream ultimately realized, the emergence of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. The problem was it cost 10 million military lives and another 10 million civilian lives to achieve this goal.
At his trial, Gavrilo Princip said he had no regrets. He would die in prison of tuberculosis shortly before the war ended. 4 years separated Franz Ferdinand's assassination and Gavrilo Princip's death. During that time, the world of kings and queens, czars and emperors that had dominated Europe throughout history joined the long list of casualties of the First World War.